Something just leaked, and it's not just messy, it's raising questions that nobody was ready for. Because what people thought they knew about Erika Kirk's past is now being completely re-examined. And at the center of it all, her Miss USA history. Yeah, the same story she's told multiple times. The random entry, the unexpected opportunity, the idea that pageants were never really part of her plan. That version, it's starting to fall apart. Because new clips, old photos, and resurfaced details are now painting a very different picture. And once people saw it, they didn't just question it, they started connecting dots. Fast. Because this isn't just about pageants anymore. It's about timing. It's about connections. And most importantly, it's about whether everything we've been told was actually true. Reports are now pointing to appearances that go all the way back to 2009, years before the timeline Erika publicly described. And that alone, that changes everything. Because if she was already deep in that world back then the It Just Happened story doesn't hold the same weight anymore. But wait, it gets even more intense. May 23rd, Arizona. Erika was once mistaken for Cameron Diaz, which led to an invitation aboard a luxurious yacht. Because this isn't just about her being in pageants earlier than expected, it's about who she was around, who she stood next to, who she shared stages with, and where those same people ended up years later. And now, people are asking a question that's making this whole situation feel way bigger than anyone thought. Was this all coincidence? Or was something being built step by step long before anyone noticed? Because trust me, what's coming next is where this story goes from surprising to seriously uncomfortable. To understand why this Miss USA leak is hitting so hard right now, you have to look at the story Erika Kirk has told about her past. Because for a long time, that story sounded simple, clean, almost accidental. According to her own interviews, the pageant world wasn't something she planned. She described it as something that just happened. A nomination showing up unexpectedly. A decision made on a whim. Something she stepped into, not something she chased. And at the time, most people accepted that, because it fit the image. A natural path, an unplanned opportunity, a story that felt relatable. But now, that version is being challenged because new details are surfacing, and they're not lining up the way people expected. Let's start with the timeline, because this is where everything begins to shift. According to the narrative that's been repeated publicly, her first real entry into the pageant world was around 2012. That's the version people knew. But now, that timeline is being questioned, because resurfaced material suggests she may have been involved years earlier, as far back as 2009. And that's not a small difference, that's a 3-year gap. 3 years where the story goes from unexpected entry to potential early involvement. And once that gap appeared, people didn't ignore it, they started digging. Because in situations like this, timelines matter. A lot. But here's where things get even more interesting. Because it's not just about when she was involved, it's about who she was involved with. Because one of the biggest talking points right now is a resurfaced image from a pageant event. A moment frozen in time. But now, that moment is being looked at very differently. Because in that same lineup, standing on that same stage, was someone else. A name that has become part of this entire conversation. Lindsay Halligan. Now on its own, that might not mean much. Pageants are full of contestants, people cross paths all the time. But here's the part that made people pause. Because years later, that same name shows up again in a completely different space. A powerful legal position. And suddenly, that old photo doesn't feel random anymore. It feels connected. Now again, these are interpretations being made by people online. But the timing, that's what's driving the conversation. And because when two people share a space early on, music, and then both rise into influential positions later, it creates questions. Questions about networks, about access, about how connections form and evolve over time. And that's exactly what people are asking right now. But it doesn't stop there, not even close. Because once people started looking at the pageant timeline, they started looking at everything else too. Career moves, public appearances, professional transitions. And that's when things started to feel layered. Because beyond the pageant world, there are mentions of other experiences. International work, charity involvement, connections to different regions, details that at first glance seem unrelated. But when placed together, they create a much bigger picture. And that picture is what's driving the speculation. Because now, instead of looking at individual events, people are looking at patterns. And when you look at patterns, you start asking different questions. Not what happened, but how did it all line up? But here's where things take another turn. Because this isn't just about her past. It's about how that past connects to her present. Because right now, Erika is not just a private individual. She's tied to the legacy of Charlie Kirk, a public figure, a brand, an entire ecosystem of influence. And when you connect those two things, past and present, the scrutiny increases. Because people aren't just looking at isolated moments anymore, they're looking at the full timeline. from early pageant appearances to later professional roles to her position today. And that's where the pressure builds, because the more you zoom out, the more complex the story becomes. But here's the key detail that's fueling everything right now, because it's not just that new information surfaced. It's that it contradicts a previously accepted narrative. And when that happens, trust gets tested. Because people start asking, what else doesn't line up? What else haven't we seen? What else could be different from what we were told? And those questions, they don't stay small, they grow fast. But to be fair, not everyone is jumping to conclusions, because there are two sides forming right now. One side says, this is being overanalyzed. People are connecting dots that don't necessarily connect. Early involvement doesn't mean anything was hidden or intentional. And that's a valid perspective, because in many cases, details from years ago don't change the bigger picture. But the other side, they see it differently. They see a timeline that doesn't match, connections that feel too aligned, moments that seem too convenient. And to them, it's not just coincidence, it's a pattern. And that's where the divide begins, because both sides are looking at the same information, but interpreting it in completely different ways. And that's exactly what makes this situation so intense, because it's not settled, it's not clear, it's still evolving. But one thing is certain, this Miss USA leak didn't just add a detail, it changed the conversation. Because now people aren't just asking about what's happening today, they're asking about what happened before, and how all of it connects. But trust me, what comes next, that's where this story stops being about timelines and starts turning into something much bigger. And this is where everything stops feeling like coincidence. Because once that timeline cracked, people didn't stop at 2009. They kept digging. And what they started finding, that's what turned this from a simple old photo resurfacing story into something much more serious. Because now, the focus isn't just on when Erika Kirk entered the pageant world, it's on what she said about it later, and whether those two things actually match. Because here's the core of the conflict. On one side, you have her own words, interviews where she describes pageants as unexpected, something that wasn't planned, something she wasn't even aiming for. On the other side, you now have resurfaced material suggesting earlier involvement, appearances, photos, connections that go further back than that random entry narrative. And when those two sides don't align, that's where the questions begin. Because this isn't just about a detail being off, it's about credibility. Because people are now asking, was it really random? Or was it something she had been involved in longer than she admitted? And that's the first twist. Because what looked like a simple origin story now feels like something that may have been reframed. But it doesn't stop there, not even close. Because once that doubt entered the conversation, everything else started getting pulled in. Past relationships, career moves, professional transitions. And suddenly, people aren't just looking at isolated facts anymore, they're looking at patterns. Because here's what's driving the speculation right now. And the idea that certain paths may not have been accidental, that certain connections may not have been random, that certain opportunities may have been part of a bigger progression. Now again, these are interpretations being made online. But the pattern? That's what's keeping the conversation alive. Because when multiple events line up in a way that feels too perfect, people start asking deeper questions. And one of the biggest questions right now is about proximity. Because being in the right place at the right time once, that's coincidence. But multiple times? That starts to look intentional. And that's exactly what critics are pointing to. They're saying, pageants to connections to opportunities to influence. A chain, a progression, a pathway that looks less random the more you examine it. But here's where things take a sharper turn. Because the conversation doesn't just stay in the pageant world. It moves into politics, into business, into influence. Because once you connect early pageant exposure with later involvement in high-level spaces, the story changes. Because now it's not just about beauty competitions. It's about access. Access to networks, access to opportunities, access to people who operate in powerful environments. And that's where the second layer of conflict appears. Because some people are now asking, were these connections already forming back then? Or are we just seeing patterns that aren't really there? But here's the twist that really pushed things over the edge. Because it's not just about her past, it's about her relationship with Charlie Kirk. Because now people are going back and looking at how that relationship began, how quickly it developed, how fast things moved, and once again, they're asking the same question. Was it natural, or was it aligned? Now to be clear, there is no confirmed evidence proving anything beyond coincidence. But that hasn't stopped the conversation. Because when people start connecting timelines, they don't just look for proof, they look for consistency. And right now, that consistency is being debated heavily. But here's where the conflict becomes even more intense. Because it's not just critics speaking, there are also defenders, people pushing back hard against these theories, saying, this is overanalysis, this is speculation, this is people taking unrelated facts and forcing them into a narrative. And that's a valid point, because in many cases, patterns can be misleading. But the problem is, the more details that surface, the harder it becomes to ignore the conversation. Because each new piece doesn't settle anything, it adds fuel. And that's exactly what's happening right now. But here's the moment that really changed everything. Because alongside the photos and timelines, old interview clips started resurfacing. Clips where Erika openly talks about ambition, about wanting success, about aiming for visibility. And while there's nothing unusual about ambition, when those statements get placed next to everything else, they get interpreted differently. Because now critics are saying, this wasn't accidental, this was intentional. Again, interpretation, not confirmed fact. But it's powerful, because it changes how people view the entire timeline, from something random to something potentially structured. Which then that's the first major twist. But here's the second, and it's even bigger. Because the conversation isn't just about her past anymore. It's about her present role, her position, her influence today. Because when someone holds a significant role, their past gets examined more closely. And right now, that examination is intense. Because every detail, every connection, every statement is being reevaluated through a new lens. And that lens is doubt, not certainty, not proof, but doubt. And doubt is powerful, because once it enters the conversation, it doesn't go away easily. It grows, it spreads, it influences perception. And that's exactly what's happening here. Because now the question isn't just, what happened back then? It's, what does it mean now? And that's where this story shifts, from a past timeline issue to a present credibility issue. But here's the part that makes this even more volatile. Because right now, there is no clear resolution, no definitive answer, no confirmed conclusion. Just two competing narratives. One that says everything is coincidence, another that says everything is connected. And both sides are gaining traction, which means the conflict isn't slowing down, it's accelerating. But trust me, what comes next? That's where the situation goes from controversial to completely out of control. And just when people thought they had already uncovered the biggest issue, that's when the story took a turn no one expected. Because this didn't stay about timelines for long, it escalated. Fast. Because once the questions around Erika Kirk's pageant history started gaining traction, people didn't stop there. They zoomed out, way out. And that's when everything started to feel connected. Because now it wasn't just about Miss USA anymore. Music. It was about patterns. Patterns involving pageants, media exposure, business moves, political proximity. And when those patterns started being placed side by side, that's when the conversation exploded. Because suddenly, it wasn't just she joined pageants earlier than expected. It became, how did every step lead to something bigger? Now again, these are interpretations being made online. But what shocked people wasn't just the connections, it was the timing. Because everything seems to line up in a way that feels too clean. From early appearances to later roles to her position today, tied to Charlie Kirk's legacy. And that's what made people stop and look twice. But here's where things take a serious turn. Because once the internet starts connecting dots, it doesn't slow down, it accelerates. And that's exactly what happened here. Because now multiple layers of the story are being pulled into the spotlight. Old interviews, career decisions, professional affiliations, all being re-examined at the same time. And when that happens, the narrative doesn't stay simple. It becomes complex, messy, and sometimes overwhelming. But here's the shocking reveal that changed everything. Because according to resurfaced material and discussions, there are claims being circulated that Erika's background wasn't as unexpected as it was presented. That there may have been more intention, more direction, more structure behind how things unfolded. Now again, these are claims and interpretations, not confirmed facts. But the impact? It's massive. Because once people start believing there's a structure behind a story, everything changes. Because now every move is questioned, every decision is analyzed, every connection is examined, and that's exactly what's happening right now. But here's where things get even more intense. Because this isn't just happening in isolation, this is happening in real time, with new clips resurfacing. Music. New discussions forming, new opinions spreading every hour. And that creates momentum. Because the more people talk about it, the bigger it gets. But here's the part that makes the situation so volatile. Because there are now two completely different interpretations of the same timeline. One side says, this is all coincidence. A person pursued opportunities, built connections, moved through different spaces naturally, nothing unusual. The other side? They see something else entirely. A path that looks intentional, connections that feel strategic, a timeline that seems too aligned to ignore. And that's where the divide becomes impossible to ignore. Because both sides are looking at the same information, but reaching completely different conclusions. And that's what makes this so powerful. Because perception shapes reality. And right now, perception is shifting. But here's where the escalation reaches its peak, because this isn't just about past events anymore. It's about trust. And because when a public figure's story is questioned, people don't just stop at one detail. They start asking, what else might not be accurate? What else could be different from what we were told? What else haven't we seen yet? And those questions, they don't stay small, they grow. And that growth is exactly what's driving this situation right now. But here's the most shocking part of all. Because despite everything, despite the clips, the photos, the discussions, there's still no definitive proof confirming the more extreme claims being made. And that creates a dangerous balance. Because on one side, you have speculation growing stronger. On the other, you have a lack of confirmed evidence. And that tension is what keeps the story alive. Because people are waiting for something concrete, something undeniable, something that either confirms everything or shuts it all down. But until that happens, the story stays in this state, unresolved, controversial, and constantly evolving. And that's exactly why it's not slowing down. Because every new detail, every resurfaced clip, every new discussion adds another layer. And those layers, they're stacking up fast. But here's the part that should really get your attention. Because right now, we are not at the end of this story. We're in the middle. And the biggest developments, they usually come next. Because once a situation reaches this level of attention, it doesn't fade quietly. It either gets clarified or it gets exposed further. And trust me, whatever happens next is going to change how this entire story is seen. Because at this point, the question isn't just what happened, it's what's still hidden. And that's exactly what everyone is waiting to find out. Music. And this is where the situation completely took over the internet. Because the moment this Miss USA leak started trending, it didn't just spark curiosity, it triggered a full-blown debate. Everywhere. Social media feeds flooded with clips, screenshots, and breakdowns. People replaying old interviews, zooming into old photos, trying to line everything up piece by piece. And the reactions? Completely split. On one side, you have people defending Erika Kirk. They're saying, this is being blown out of proportion. Everyone has a past. This doesn't mean anything. People are connecting dots that don't actually connect. To them, this isn't a scandal. It's overanalysis. A situation where normal life experiences are being turned into something bigger than they really are. But on the other side, you have people who see it very differently. They're not just questioning one detail. They're questioning the entire timeline. They're saying, the story doesn't match anymore. There are too many coincidences. Something about this feels off. And that's where the tension really starts. Because now it's not just about facts. It's about interpretation. And interpretation, that's where things get messy. Because once people start forming narratives, those narratives spread fast. But here's what makes this reaction different from a typical online debate. It's the intensity. Because this isn't just casual discussion. People are invested emotionally, intellectually, even personally. Because this situation touches on something bigger. Trust. Because when a public figure's story gets questioned, people don't just react to the detail itself, they react to what it represents. And right now, it represents uncertainty. But here's where things get even more interesting. Because this reaction isn't just coming from random users, it's spreading into wider conversations, commentators, online personalities, people with large audiences, all weighing in, all offering their perspectives. And that's when the situation escalates further. Because once larger voices join the conversation, the reach multiplies, the visibility increases, and the pressure, it rises. Because now every new detail isn't just being discussed, it's being amplified. But here's the most important part. Because despite all the noise, all the debate, all the speculation, there is still no clear conclusion, no official confirmation, no definitive answer, just a growing conversation. And that's what makes this so powerful. Because people aren't reacting to certainty, they're reacting to possibility. And possibility is what keeps attention alive. Because as long as there's uncertainty, there's curiosity, there's engagement, there's discussion. But here's where things take another turn. Because the longer this conversation continues, the more it shapes perception. Because even without proof, repeated narratives start to feel real. Not because they're confirmed, but because they're everywhere. And that's the risk in situations like this. Because perception can shift before facts are established. But here's the part that keeps this story from settling. Because there's still a strong pushback. People reminding others that not everything is connected. Not every timeline discrepancy means something bigger. Not every coincidence is intentional. And that pushback, it's important, because it keeps the conversation balanced. But it also keeps the debate alive. Because now it's not just one narrative dominating, it's two. And both are strong, both are persistent, both are gaining attention. Which means this situation isn't calming down, it's building. But here's the most powerful reaction of all. The shift in how people are now looking at everything. Because this isn't just about pageants anymore, it's about past versus present. Narrative versus reality, perception versus truth. And that's why this story is sticking. Because it's not just a single moment, it's a reevaluation of everything. And once that starts, it's very hard to stop. But here's the key point. Because despite all the reactions, all the opinions, all the debates, nothing has been resolved yet. No final answer, no confirmed conclusion, and that's exactly why people are still watching. Because as long as there's no resolution, there's room for more. More details, more discussion, more revelations. And that's what everyone is waiting for. Because the next piece of information, the next clip, the next statement could completely change everything. And trust me, at this point, everyone knows it. And just when it feels like every detail has already been pulled apart, that's when the biggest question of all starts to surface. Not about one photo, not about one interview, but about the entire story. Because what if this isn't just about a timeline being slightly off? What if it's about how the story was presented in the first place? Because right now everything comes back to one central issue: credibility. Because when people look at Erika Kirk's past, they're not just asking what happened, they're asking, music. Was it told accurately? And that single question, it changes everything. Because if even one part of a public narrative doesn't line up, people don't stop there. They start looking at everything. And that's exactly what's happening now. Because the conversation has shifted from, was she in pageants earlier, to, what else might be different from what we were told? And that's the final twist. Because this isn't about one detail anymore. It's about trust in the full timeline. But here's where things get even more intense. Because while all of this is happening, there's still no clear resolution, no official clarification, no detailed breakdown addressing every claim, just silence. And silence in situations like this, it creates space. Space for speculation, space for interpretation, space for narratives to grow. And that's exactly what we're seeing. Because now two completely different realities are forming. One where everything is coincidence, a normal path, a series of unrelated events, a story that just happens to look more connected than it actually is. And another where everything feels structured, a timeline that appears intentional, connections that seem aligned, a story that looks less random the more you examine it. And the truth? Right now, it sits somewhere in the middle. Unclear. Unconfirmed, but heavily debated. But here's the part that really keeps people locked in. Music. Because this story isn't slowing down, it's accelerating. More clips are resurfacing, more discussions are happening, more people are joining the conversation every day. And that means one thing. We're not at the end. We're at the turning point. Because situations like this don't just fade away. They build, they evolve, they either get clarified or they get exposed further. And right now, no one knows which direction this is going. But here's the final question that everyone is thinking, even if they're not saying it out loud. If this is just the beginning, then what happens when more comes out? Because if even one new piece of solid information drops, it could shift everything, completely. The narrative, the perception, the entire understanding of the situation. And that's what makes this moment so critical. Because right now, everything is still in motion. Nothing is locked in. Nothing clears throat is finalized. But the pressure, it's building. And pressure like this always leads to something. A statement, a response, or a revelation. And trust me, when that moment comes, it's going to be big. Because this story has already crossed the line from curiosity to controversy. And once it's there, it doesn't go back. It only moves forward. And something tells me the next update is going to change everything. Now, I want to hear from you, because this is one of those situations where your opinion actually matters. Do you think people are over-analyzing Erika Kirk's past? Or do you believe there are too many inconsistencies to ignore? Because let's be honest. On one hand, it's possible that this is just a timeline issue. A few details that don't perfectly line up but don't necessarily mean anything bigger. But on the other hand, when multiple things start raising questions, it's hard not to look deeper. So where do you stand? Is this all coincidence? Or does it feel like something more? Drop your thoughts in the comments right now. And don't just say yes or no, explain your reasoning. Because the best part about conversations like this is hearing different perspectives. Also, if you've been following this story closely, make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because this isn't over. Not even close. More details are still coming out, more discussions are still happening, and there's a very real chance that something major could drop at any moment. And when it does, you already know we'll be here breaking it down instantly, because whatever happens next is going to define how this entire story is understood. So, stay locked in, because the next update might be the one that finally answers everything, or makes it even more complicated.